5 a.m.
Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to 5 a.m. with Dr. Randy Turpin. I'm Randy Turpin, your host, and I'm excited about us connecting again today. In recent episodes, we've enjoyed conversations with various individuals, but today it's just me. There's so many things going on currently. I just want to talk about it a little bit without getting too much in the details, but more into the principle of things. A lot of things are competing for our attention, and I'm sensing a great need to renew our focus on the essentials for the Christian life. Maybe you're already doing well with this, but it seems to me that a lot of believers are getting distracted and are allowing things to shape their perception of reality that they shouldn't. Be careful, like I say frequently, be careful of what you allow to shape your perception of reality. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul instructs us to set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And in a similar way, Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 tells us, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. These passages remind us that our minds and hearts do need direction. We need to intentionally fix our gaze on Jesus Christ. As the book of Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, we're to fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, or the author and finisher of faith. In our day, we need to ensure that we're on rock-solid ground in our devotion to Jesus. He is to be our fixation, not the latest controversy, not political divisions, not even the legitimate concerns that fill our news feeds and social media timelines. Jesus Christ is to be our fixation. He is our focus. I'm reminded of Jesus' powerful words about building our lives on rock rather than sand, about the differences between merely hearing his words versus actually putting them into practice. It's not enough to simply acknowledge who Jesus is. We must follow what he says. Today we're going to dip into the archives, digging out some of my, I've been doing this over the last few days, going through some of my old episodes and seeing what might be relevant to the season that we're in right now. And this one particular episode I came across from my old YouTube channel. I retrieved an episode of 10 Minutes with Dr. Randy Turpin. And this episode's entitled The Rock Solid Life. I could just give you a brand new presentation of it, but I thought about, well, the way I said it there was about as good as I can say it. So I'm just going to insert this in a few moments. I believe this message is particularly relevant for our current moment, this 5 a.m. time, when we really need stable footing in an unstable world. So here goes some things I said just a few years back about the rock-solid life. I want to return now to this theme on the rock-solid life. What I'm looking at in particular is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, he talks about the person who hears his sayings, what he had been saying in the Sermon on the Mount, and actually puts his sayings into action. He describes that person as a person who's building their life on a rock. When adversity comes, they're not swept away. They hear his sayings and they do them. The other is the person who hears his sayings but does not do them. That person is like the man who built his house on the sand. Adversity comes and he's swept away. If the sayings of Jesus in his sermon here are that significant, that doing what he's saying in this Sermon on the Mount helps a person to have a stable life, a rock-solid life, then I want to know what those teachings are. And if it's, and likewise, if it's the case that those who do not put these teachings into practice are like those who build on the sand, again, I want to know what these teachings are, because I want to make sure I'm building on the rock. Now, we know that Jesus is the rock. We know that the revelation of the lordship of Jesus is a rock, but we do have a responsibility to go beyond just the initial revelation of who he is. We have a responsibility not just to embrace who Jesus is, we also have an obligation to do what Jesus says, to obey him, to follow his instructions. If you want to know how do you build upon the foundation, that is Jesus, the way we build upon the foundation is through obeying Jesus Christ, obeying his instructions. Isn't it interesting that before Jesus gets into any commandments or instructions to us, he first blesses us. He said, "Blessed are the poor in the spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness." And then right out of that, he continues to bring affirmation before he gets into instruction. Here's where he talks about us being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Once again, he's affirming people that were otherwise marginalized people who were oppressed, people who were made to feel as though they were insignificant. Jesus is speaking to these people, saying, you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth. So he's still not getting into a lot of instruction here. He's still affirming, okay? So I believe that part of the rock-solid life is, first of all, believing what Jesus says about you. That's where it begins. And he goes on to say in chapter 5, verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So there are works involved in this Christian life. We're not saved by our works, but we are saved for good works, aren't we? So if you want to be building upon the solid rock, Jesus Christ, and the revelation of who he is, then we need to be engaged in good works, all right? And this next part, everything that we're reading so far in chapter 5 is a preface to instruction. The Beatitudes is part of the preface. Even his statements about us being salt and light is a preface. And the next thing is also part of the preface, where he said, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. No, he is about to fulfill the law, take the law to I'm talking about the law and the purposes of God to a deeper level. What Jesus is about to do is to get at the very heart of what the law was all about in the Old Testament. He's about to get to the heart of even what his teaching is all about in the New Testament. Here's a key thing here. Here's a key thing. He says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. What? Scribes and Pharisees were severe, so we've got to be more severe. We've got to be more firm. No. The way that our righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees is that through Jesus, we have been given the opportunity to get at the very heart. I'm coming back to it again. The very heart of what God the Father truly is. What he's really after is our hearts. If he's got our hearts, then our behavior is going to line up. Okay? And so then he gets into some very specific examples. I don't know that Jesus is trying to give an exhaustive covering of everything that concerns life. But he's giving us some pretty good examples here of what getting at the heart of the revealed will of God is all about. He said, this is in Matthew 5:21. You have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment. Now, what's Jesus doing? Here, you're going to see a series of 5 statements. There's 5 of them in the Sermon on the Mount, where he begins it by saying, you have heard. He says, you have heard, you have heard, you have heard, you have heard. There's 5 of them. He's referring back to the Old Testament law, okay? He says, you have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not murder. And the next one's down to verse 27. You've heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not commit adultery, okay? Then over in verse 33 says, you have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not swear falsely. Then the 5th one, or the 4th one, is in verse 38, where he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, okay? Then in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Okay, so he's referring back to old covenant teaching. But what he does right after that, in each of these presentations, he then moves away from just the written law, not abolishing it, but getting to the heart of it. This is what it's really all about. And this is what I have to say to you about it. Some people, they get concerned about a message, about a grace message. And they think, well, if you're just preaching grace, 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 you're being too easy on people, and you're not bringing to them the weightier matters of the revealed will of God. Well, here's the thing. Grace is more demanding on us than the law ever was. It truly is. See, the law addressed behavior. Grace addresses the heart. Let's go back to the one on anger. He says, you have heard that it was said by the ancients, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment. Verse 22 takes it to the heart. He says, but I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And he elaborates on it there, okay? What is the underlying motivation behind murder? It's anger, isn't it? So basically, Jesus is saying you've got to pay attention to the attitude of the heart. What this should cause us to do is to come before the Lord in humility, in prayer, and say, God, my Father, I'm carrying anger and unforgiveness right now. And according to what Jesus is saying, this is as though I've actually murdered this person. But I want to encourage you to go ahead and read Matthew 5. You'll see here the underlying motivations behind, of course, anger and sexual purity, fidelity in marriage. He deals here with revenge. He deals here with loving our enemies. He deals with the essential role of prayer as it relates to the rock-solid life. What I'm really talking about is the last part of chapter 7. Jesus talked about those who hear his sayings and actually do what he says. That's a person that's living a rock-solid life. If you're doing what Jesus says. If you're ignoring what Jesus says, then you're like the person that's building on the sand. Okay, that was from our archives, but the message is perhaps even more relevant today than when I first recorded it. Jesus' teaching about building on rock versus sand cuts right to the heart of our current challenges. What struck me again in listening to this is how Jesus always goes deeper than surface level obedience. He's after our hearts. The Sermon on the Mount isn't simply a new set of rules. It's an invitation to allow God's grace to transform us from the inside out. When Jesus addresses anger, relationships, truthfulness, revenge, and love for enemies, he's showing us that a rock-solid life has deep foundations. As I mentioned in the teaching, grace is more demanding on us than the law ever was. The law addressed behavior, but grace addresses the heart. In these turbulent times, this 5 a.m. moment, we need this kind of solid foundation more than ever. We can't afford to build on the shifting sands of cultural opinions, political ideologies, or even our own preferences and comfort. Only by hearing Jesus' words and putting them into practice can we stand firm when storms come. And what I'm really getting after here is, yes, there are times for us to engage culture and what's going on, even politically and all of this, but unless you and I are in a good place with Jesus on a personal level, then we're not going to have solid footing. We will be shaken by the things that's shaking the rest of the world. And that really should not be for those of us who are children of God. I want to encourage you to spend some time this week reading through Matthew chapters 5 through 7. That starts with the Beatitudes and goes all the way to the imagery that Jesus gives about building on rock instead of sand. And all of that in between is called the Sermon on the Mount. And as you're going through that, ask yourself, in what areas am I merely hearing Jesus' words but not doing them? Where do I need grace to transform not just my actions, but my heart? Well, that about wraps it up for today. If you found any value in today's episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with others who might benefit. Check the description for links to resources. We have a few things there that I think might help you in digging deeper to building a rock-solid life that's centered on Jesus. Remember, friends, though it may seem dark around us, dawn is approaching. Let's continue to be people who build on the rock, who set our minds on things above, and fix our eyes on Jesus. Let's be morning people. Let's be children of the day, expectantly watching for the light, even when surrounded by darkness. Remember, figuratively speaking, it is 5 a.m.